Per Söderqvist.
My name is Alexander Hägglund.
And today we have a really exciting topic that we'll be talking about, some telemetry on targeted attacks. So what we're going to do in today's session is we're going to be talking about some of the information that we've gathered when we've looked at different types of targeted attacks and try to explain also some of the statistics and basically provide an overview of how the different hacking groups are acting. But before we begin, just kind of high level, wanted to explain a little bit about the different types of cyber attacks. So first of all, many of you are probably familiar with the generic malware and spray and pray types of attacks. And probably at some point or another, you've come across this yourself. This is usually when you receive an email with either a link or an attachment, and you are kind of encouraged into clicking on that link or opening up that attachment and maybe enabling some macros. And these types of attacks are most of the time just targeted towards single individuals, and most organizations have pretty good routines in how to handle these types of attacks. But what we're going to be talking about more today is the advanced persistent threats or targeted attacks and supply chain attacks. These are a lot more sophisticated. We do see that the cyber criminals, they really take their time to use either more sophisticated types of social engineering or through vulnerabilities gain access into an organization and try to move as silently as possible to avoid detection. Anything to add here, Alex?
Yeah, I mean, based on the telemetry that we've seen and everything that we have gathered so far, it's definitely, the trend is definitely the APTs and the targeted attacks right now. And they're definitely not leaving anything to chance either. They're really taking their time, just as you said, and really making the time worth and making their money worth for, engaging in that specific targeted attack and infiltrating that organization. So it's definitely something that we see more and more often. So the trend has been to move away from that generic type of malware and just trying to get as many organizations as possible into the loop and just focusing on single bigger targets with these targeted attacks.
Yeah, and also to provide some high-level statistics here, we do see that, of course, this is probably not a surprise to many of you, but the frequency of ransomware attacks have increased a lot during the last couple of years. So just going back to 2016, we saw an attack occurring approximately every 40 seconds, whereas now it's about every 11th second that we do see a ransomware attack occurring. But a bit more worrying statistic is that we do see that it takes on average 197 days until an organization realizes that they've been breached. And that's an extremely worrying statistic. And this kind of indicates the need to have the right tools so that you can get the visibility into what's actually happening within your organization.
Yeah, and it's not only about the forensics tools or the threat hunting tools. It's also about IT operations, being able to quickly assess any types of vulnerabilities in applications that you're using. So patching and everything like that. But having that visibility in place and making sure that you have the right tools to gather that data on your own organization and in your environment is also really vital. And it's like you say, it's worrying that it takes 197 days in this day and age to discover a breach, and that's because they're getting more and more sophisticated. And I mean, you need those more advanced tools in order to discover those kind of needles in the haystack.
Yeah. And unfortunately, this is a trend that we keep on seeing just growing over time. And there are a lot of new groups popping up all the time. And it's a very lucrative business for the cyber criminals. And And there are quite a few, and especially a few of them that made a name for themselves during last year. So one of the example is the Dark Side hacking group. They were behind the Colonial Pipeline attack that many of you probably read about in the media, and also REvil or Revil that were behind the Kaseya attack during last year. That really made the news and created a lot of media attention around this problem that we're seeing. However, this is a problem that we've been tracking for quite some time, and we do see that, of course, when kind of larger enterprises or these really broad scale attacks, this is when you get the media attention, but we do also see a lot of smaller organizations getting hit by the same types of attacks.
Yeah, you really bring up a good point there, because this is not a new phenomena. This is really something that has been going on for a long time now, for decades even. It's just now that media started to pick this up and really put it in the spotlight, that we're paying more attention to it. But in fact, this has been going on for a very, very long time, which is also alarming.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk a little bit extra about one particular group that we've seen, especially lately. They've been utilizing the Log4j vulnerability, for example, but the group is called the Conti ransomware group. And they've been really active. They are kind of doing pretty much the same as many of the other groups, whereas they manage to infiltrate an organization, they kind of live off the land, ensure that they don't get detected. They steal data from that organization, and then eventually they kind of execute a ransomware as the final step. They also have this website called Conti News website. And this is where they would publish data from an organization that they've managed to infiltrate that have decided not to pay the ransom. And also another question that I get quite often is kind of what different industries and sectors are mainly being targeted by these types of cyber criminals. And what we're seeing is that it really doesn't matter that much. They're just going after the low-hanging fruit, so to say. Just trying to collect as much data as possible on vulnerabilities that you might have, and then try to utilize them to gain access into an organization. And we actually managed to get some additional information because we were involved in helping a customer that got hit by the Conti ransomware group. But before we go in and talk a little bit more about that particular scenario, we just wanted to kind of put out some different hacker dictionaries so that you know what we're talking about. And one terminology that we might say and name drop every now and then is IoCs or IOAs. And these are indications of compromises or indications of an attack. And basically what I would summarize this as is more of a suspicious event, a legitimate kind of thing or a command has been executed in your environment, but it could potentially be seen as a suspicious event.
Don't forget about my favorite, the lol bins. We'll probably name drop that one as well a couple of times.
Exactly. So I thought maybe you can talk through the other ones as well.
Yeah, so these are basically the most common terms and words we'll probably throw around during the course of the webinar. And first of all, like Per mentioned, you have the IoCs and IOAs, and we have the TTPs, which are tactics, techniques, and procedures. Living off the land or living off the land binaries are basically processes and services and programs that already exist on the platform or in the operating system that you are attacking. So, for example, in Windows, you have CMD and PowerShell, etc., that you can utilize in order to or leverage in order to attack the victim's machine. A vulnerability is a problem in an application which is used to execute third-party code. So when you have an exploit for a vulnerability, you usually you basically use that code in order to exploit that vulnerability in that particular application. So For example, you can take Eternal Blue as an example, where we managed to exploit a part of the Windows kernel in order to leverage and execute a payload within the Windows system. So a payload being a malicious code that is executed after exploitation in order to gain some kind of foothold maybe in the machine, or execute a Trojan or something like that. We might also mention meter preader shells, or more commonly the Cobalt Strike shells or payloads, which are basically command line interfaces to the Metasploit framework or the Cobalt Strike framework. You might also hear the word listener being mentioned, where we are basically setting up a process that is listening on a specific IP address in order to receive incoming connections. So it's basically just listening for example, a meter preader shell payload.
Yeah. And like I mentioned, we also managed to actually get our hands on kind of going back a little bit. Customer that got hit by the Conti ransomware group. And we also then got the opportunity to go back and get a better understanding of what actually happened here. And one thing that we first of all saw was the first day of the attack. This was, we could also determine that they managed to get in through a vulnerability in a firewall. And once they utilized that vulnerability, they were able to take over 2 servers at the same time. And from there, they basically started to map out the environment. So they ran a bunch of different commands on the server. And this is coming back a little bit to the IoCs. This is something that is often quite good, that you have a tool that can quickly pick up on if some commands are running in a sequence of events, going back a little bit to the TTPs, understanding how they operate, so that you know what to actually also look for. But it also shows that these cyber criminals, they use or leverage automation a lot. So basically scanning the entire internet and just finding these types of vulnerabilities that they can utilize in order to perform an attack against an organization.
A very good tool, and a very good example of that is Showdown, which is used to find these hosts and find these vulnerable servers that are located around the world. So there are lots of good tools in order to find these hosts. So that's why it's so important to not publish them on the internet unpatched or without a firewall in place.
Yeah. And Showdown is a good example, both being utilized by kind of the black hats of the world and white hats as well. So both sides are using this tool. Also, if we look on the second day of the attack, and this is something that we often see as well in these more targeted attacks. So actually no activity was recorded on the second day. Could be or for a number of reasons. Maybe they had a day off, or they had something more urgent to work on. But it's a very common trend in these types of attacks. And then on the third day of the attack, this was when they came back. They started to kind of map out. They already had all the information about the environment that they managed to compromise, but now they also started to look for any type of valuable data, anything that had that was kind of data from the human resource department, IT department, credit department, accounting, or senior staff, or anything labeled as budget. And they took all that information, all that data, and uploaded it to a service online called Mega, just using normal web ports 443. Again, this is also quite common if they were to use like FTP, that might trigger an alarm. But if they're just going through regular web traffic, they are less likely to get detected. And then on the fourth day of the attack, this was when they actually started to try to target the endpoints of that organization using Cobalt Strike and they tried to deploy the ransomware on 300 endpoints and servers across the network. And I highlighted some of the commands that were used during this attack. And this is coming back to the IOCs, why it's so important that you have tools that can quickly pick up on if these types of commands are being executed. And we do see that the hacking groups, they are continuously evolving, and the IOCs are continuously changing. So it's something that's important that you continuously also keep track on what to actually look for.
Yeah, and you make a good point there, and also as we mentioned with the living of the land binaries, where you're using processes and functions that already exist in Windows, for example, this is a really good example of that. So you can see that they're using CMD, for example. They're launching VMI, so the Windows Management Instrumentation Service, in order to basically laterally move and try to create processes on remote computers. So this is a really good example on how you use the living of the land binaries in order to execute certain parameters and processes on, in the entire network, basically, or on the host itself. And again, just like Per mentioned, it's really important to have these tools in order to detect these IOCs. And this is basically pure telemetry that we have gathered, and being able to pull out this kind of information from this telemetry is also really, really valuable. So this is why we've been able to compile all this information based on this really detailed telemetry that we have from the endpoints. So in order to map up the techniques and all of the different kinds of attacks and tools that the attackers are using, we usually use the MITRE attack framework. So the MITRE attack frameworks is a database basically on methods, techniques, different kinds of tools, and a mapping of how an attack or how a reconnaissance may be executed, or the initial access is being made, or the persistence is being deployed, and the exploitation, etc. So this is a fantastic framework that you can use in order to map against these kind of attacks and against these techniques, and you also get the valuable information of being able to use this in, for example, methodology hunting, when you're performing threat hunts, when you're doing forensics, and as a SOC technician, this is really, really invaluable when you're actually performing a live threat hunt in an environment. Anything you want to add there, Per?
No, I think I can move on to this slide, and kind of coming back a little bit to what we're seeing, the telemetry that we're gathering, and this is from the tactics seen in escalated cases during the last year and the year before that. And what's really interesting mapping this to the MITRE attack framework is that you do see, of course, that a lot of the tactics or a lot of the detections have been made in the early stages of the attack chain. And then, well, when you move down the ladder and you kind of see this as an attack, how it unfolds on an organization, with the initial attack or initial access as one of the first steps, and then kind of the execution, persistence, then privilege escalation, and so on. All of these different steps, you can also map out how often we're actually seeing these being utilized as well. And of course, another important thing here is that you want to work as proactively as possible. You want to catch everything as quickly as possible. So that's also another very important aspect here.
Yeah, and I just want to mention in the media and in the news, you're usually focusing a lot on the last two pillars there, so the exfiltration and the impact. But as you can see, the other pillars or the other tactics and attacks are much more frequent, and those are the ones that are the most dangerous ones as well. So if you have someone in your network being able to, for example, laterally move or perform command and control, credential access, privilege escalation, that means that they have full control over your network. So the last step and the last action that they take is actually to deploy a ransomware, which is the impact in this case, or exfiltrate data. So I mean, when you have someone with that kind of access in your network, then it's really dangerous. If we circle back to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, these are some of the techniques that we observed during these advanced attacks during 2020 and 2021. So as you can see, it's a pretty extensive list, from everything from initial access to credential theft, lateral movement, etc. So all of these tactics and techniques were actually observed during these attacks that we saw in 2020 and 2021 using the telemetry that we gathered. So and what's important here is that this data and this information actually help you as an organization to prioritize what is important. So during an attack, you have a template basically showing you that, okay, you have persistence being seen here. We have techniques that are using privilege escalation, for example, that will help you in the threat hunting part, and also to prioritize what is important to actually stop, and how you're supposed to which tools you're supposed to be using in order to stop the attack in its early stages. And it also helps you to assess the current risk of that particular attack, which can be really, in that moment when you only have minutes, basically, this can be invaluable information.
Yeah, I also want to highlight that this information is very useful, and please take a screenshot of it. You'll find it very useful when kind of understanding a little bit more. Okay, this is what we're seeing. This is what our SOC is seeing. The 5 top techniques that are being utilized in the wild by our customers. So we can see, for an example, if we look at the lateral movement, the RDP is on the top there. One of the most common methods that they're using in order to laterally move across the network. Okay, so maybe we can take a step back and see how can we do we actually need RDP to be available for every user? Can we enable additional security around that, and so on and so on?
Yeah, and also circling back to the techniques that we saw, and the really, you know, when we dig down deeper and look at what's actually going on in detail, we could see once again that it's that there's a lot of living off the land binary techniques being used. So the Windows Management Instrumentation Service is a really key player here. So using that to, for example, create processes on remote computers, launch malware on remote computers using, for example, a drive-by download, etc. So there's been a lot of that going on, and also creating or modifying processes, masquerading processes, process hollowing, for example, executing registry run keys, startup folders. So these were basically the top 20 detections that we saw that triggered something, that triggered an investigation that we had to actually engage in during these years. So this was really interesting to dig down a bit deeper into, and really watch that telemetry to see what they were actually doing. So looking at that and just like Per mentioned, you know, they're constantly evolving and making use of these tactics in different ways in order to try to conceal themselves or obfuscate their code in better ways. So it's really interesting to see, you know, how crafty they actually are.
Yeah, and also if we look a little bit more on the key findings from incident response investigation, there are a couple of numbers here that really stand out. So one example is the 11 days. That was from the initial kind of compromise of an organization until the actual deployment of ransomware. So meaning that they've actually had then control on average for 11 days until they actually executed the ransomware, as again coming back to one of the final steps of the actual attack. And also 81% of the attacks involved ransomware. So coming back or circling back to that a little bit, of course, this is still one of the biggest problems that a lot of organizations are talking about. But I would also be extremely worried about the other 19%. What are they actually doing? If they manage to get persistence within an organization and just idling there and continuously gathering information, stealing data from that organization is something that's quite worrying.
Yeah, and I think that, if you look at the 54% of the attacks involve unprotected systems, to me, that's pretty alarming. Would you say that that is a common trend among customers, that they're choosing not to protect certain systems or disabling protections even?
Yeah, actually, this is something that we come across every now and then, and this is something that we're actually helping a lot of our customers with as well. And it's just understanding that you need to ensure that you have a full visibility of your organization. Everything needs to be protected. I often come across, customers that think, okay, well, the servers, we don't need to protect them. I have a couple of Linux desktops or servers. I don't need to have any protection running on them. Or the classic, if you are a Mac user, you definitely don't need any protection, right? But it's coming back to that visibility piece, and one tactic that we're often seeing by the hacking groups is that they'll try to find unprotected systems and kind of use that as their base, or that's kind of the starting point from where they can then laterally move and take control of the network. Yes. The other thing that I also found quite interesting is the 27% of the attacks. We also saw some data stealing and exfiltration, like we saw in the example with the Conti ransomware group. That was one of their tactics. But of course, it's not every single group that's performing this. Some of the hacking groups will basically just run the ransomware as soon as they manage to get a foothold into that particular organization. Anything else that stands out from your point of view here?
No, I mean, the dwell time is also really interesting, and you already picked up on that, but it just goes to show that what we talked about previously when it comes to actually gaining a foothold and persistence in your network, that's the most dangerous part, because they will be there and they can do whatever they want. So, I mean, during those 11 days, I mean, you can wreak havoc. You can install Bitcoin miners, you can steal credentials, you can steal other kinds of data and valuable information, even credit card information. Anything can be done when you're inside a network for that amount of time. So that's I mean, to me, that's really interesting.
Yeah. And also that we already talked about the RDP as one example that's commonly being used for laterally moving within an organization. So definitely something to have a close look at as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about the top 15 tools that we are commonly seeing?
Yeah, this is an interesting one, because we see that first and foremost, Cobalt Strike is being involved in pretty much every attack these days. And that's because it's such a potent tool. I mean, the Cobalt Strike framework is amazing from a pen tester perspective, and also from a red teamer perspective, but it's unfortunately landed in the hands of the hackers as well, and all the hacking groups out there. So they're actually leveraging the malleable C2 scripts and the Cobalt Strike beacons in order to create really crafty command and control servers to make sure that they establish that persistence and foothold within the organization. And also we see that PowerShell is often used as a initiator. So they use PowerShell in order to download the payloads or execute the scripts in order to gain that persistence or foothold, or download the Cobalt Strike beacons even. The sad thing here is that they're actually using legitimate tools in order to weaponize them during the targeted attacks. And a really good example of that, or a really bad example, depending on how you look at it, is Gmer, for example, which is an anti-rootkit utility, which has been used by security enthusiasts for I mean, decades. I've been using it for a lot of instances back in 2010, for example. It's a really good tool, and we've now seen that they're using that in order to leverage the capabilities of that particular application within Windows, and the legitimate way it's actually trusted and performing attacks on systems. Same with Mimikatz, but also the most obvious tools are, for example, the PSExec and the PS Tool Suite, and that's the reason why security vendors now have chosen to automatically block the PS tool suite out of the box because they're so commonly used in attacks. And I mean, you had some good ideas regarding PowerShell, right, Per?
Yeah, I mean, one key aspect is definitely that you have within your security solution the anti-malware scanning interface enabled, AMSI. That if you have an obfuscated script running in PowerShell, AMSI allows you to actually get a better visibility into what that script contains, what is it actually doing. So that's one of the recommendations for sure. But also, like you mentioned, it's often being leveraged or used in early stages. We see this quite often in kind of social engineering attacks. You know, could be an end user gets an attachment, a Word document that contains some macros, and then usually will run some PowerShell script in order to create that backdoor into that organization. So something to definitely have a look at.
Definitely. Something that is really important is minimizing the time it takes for your organization or for you as a forensic specialist or threat hunter to detect these threats and respond to them. So in all of these stages, in all of these phases of the kill chain, as we call it, or during these phases when they execute these tactics, it's very important to have a protection in place, but also something that can detect and respond to these tactics. So the first one being the initiating phase, where we usually see a spam email, for example, with some kind of malicious document. There you have a number of tools and protections in place which you can use in order to protect yourself against these particular threats in that phase of the kill chain. So the important factor here being that you need to have a really potent next generation protection that is able to proactively detect these new payloads, these new weaponized documents, and all of these scripts that are obfuscated within these payload or within these documents, basically. And also, of course, being able to stop the attacker techniques. So everything that we've been talking about with the MITRE ATT&CK framework and the techniques and tools being used, it's really important that you have a protection in place and something that can actually block the execution before they're actually able to do so. So when we look at the Cobalt Strike payloads, for example, they're usually masked and their behavior are changed using, for example, the malleable C2 framework in order to evade and try to sneak past all these security solutions on the endpoint. So, and this is why it's so important to have a behavioral detection engine which can look deeper into this and what they're actually doing within the system, and then convict the actual attack during that stage. Same goes for credential theft. Make sure that you have some kind of credential theft protection. It prevents the attacker from actually escalating their privileges and being able to laterally move within the network. If you move a bit further ahead here, so moving laterally, you need to have something in place that can stop them from doing so. And a really good example of that is endpoint stonewalling or dynamic firewall rules based on the IPS that we see. So if you couple the behavioral detection with an IPS, for example, you're able to actually act on what's happening within the TCP/IP packets, and based on that create dynamic firewall rules. So that's also something that can stop the attacker from moving laterally within the network. And of course, it's really important to have some kind of backup in place. You need to have a good tamper protection, because every attack out there, every ransomware, every automated attack or ransomware or rootkit, whatever you have it, they will have routines or scripts baked into the script itself that will try to disable each and every security protection out there. Everything from Windows Defender to Kaspersky to Sophos, they will try to disable it in any possible way they can. So that's why it's so important to have a tamper protection, which basically protects the protection, which helps you better in the long run.
Yeah, and also another very important piece is, of course, to have additional behavior analysis in regards to kind of ransomware attacks, because we do see them still in the more generic or spray and pray types of attacks, but also being used in targeted attacks, and having a more sophisticated protection layer that can detect this. However, this, as you can see on this slide as well, is one of the last or final kind of protection layers that you have. And if one word of advice is that if you do start to see detections coming from, in this example, from CryptoGuard, there's definitely some work to be done in the earlier stages. And a couple of years, especially ago, a lot of companies were talking about, the end user being kind of the first layer of defense, making sure that you're educating your users. And this is still very relevant, that awareness, that they kind of think one extra time before they click on an email or if they open up an attachment, but also ensuring that you have layers of protections that can prevent a sophisticated attack like this.